So part of what I want to start with is really a framework, an area where we can start here with our approach to gender and understanding gender diversity movements, and also depathologizing people who question gender norms and gender expectations. So first, I want to start by conceptualizing gender as an area that's ripe with diversity. As with the case of all of our natural world, diversity is inherent in the development, lived experiences, and the very fabric across our lives. Gender identity is no different. Our gender identities, the way we choose to express ourselves, they're varied, and we should expect that there's a spectrum of gender identities and expressions, including cisgender and transgender identities, both of which should be valid and accepted. Second, gender diversity is not something new. It's not a white, Western concept. Gender variance has really existed across time and across cultures. It's what we've seen with colonization, with patriarchy, and the strict policing of gender roles is that much of the rich gendered histories that we wish we could fall back to don't exist. And for those who do exist, we've seen a resurgence of wanting to understand, hey, where do these identities come from? Where are our histories? Where do we lie? And so I think this is a big piece of the puzzle, right? This is not new. Third, being gender creative, gender diverse, pushing against gendered expectations, it's not pathological. We don't need a fix, we don't need a cure. These are some of the bedrock of how I approach my work. And that gender is expansive, that we should all have a chance to play with gender, to explore what it means for us to live in various gendered ways, and to push against these gendered expectations in ways that feel fun and authentic and aligned. However, we are also still working towards trans justice and liberation, and it's important to talk about the social, legal, and political landscape. We have headlines that read, healthcare for transgender adults becomes new target in 2023 legislative session. What's behind the rise of anti-trans bills in the US? Activists say everyone should be alarmed. 2023 wave of bills is fueling a political war against LGBTQ+ people, news reports show. Florida legislator passes an extreme anti-trans bathroom bill and gender-affirming care ban and egregious assault on parental rights. A majority of Americans reject anti-trans bills, but support for these restrictions is rising. 2023, a record year for anti-trans legislation across the country. It's only April, and the situation is static. Trans people in Florida are desperate. I will say trans people in Florida are desperate, but so are trans people everywhere. These headlines about restricting access to gender-affirming healthcare, banning kids from sports, bathroom bills, they're commonplace at this point. And we've been fighting this anti-trans legislation, and it's being proposed and it's also being passed. I think that's an important piece, that we don't just see that these proposals are going up, but they're being passed across several states, and it's, I will say, absolutely horrific for the folks and the parents who love us, the teachers and therapists and doctors who are trying to provide care and support us, to provide life-saving gender-affirming care. So what we know is that this discrimination, prejudice, oppression, victimization that trans people experience can lead to health disparities. And we call this the minority stress model. So it's important to understand the impact of oppression, prejudice, and discrimination on the lives of trans people, and we understand it through this mechanism. So this gender minority stress and resilience model helps us to explain the connection between these distal stressors, these external forces, the legislation that's happening, these external pieces of discrimination, rejection, victimization, non-affirmation of identity, and how these negatively impact our mental and physical health. We see that there are higher rates of anxiety, depression, suicidality, substance use. We see all of these stressors. We also know that trans people, as they contend with these external stressors, then can sometimes internalize these stressors, right? The internalization of these negative messages, expecting negative interactions, expecting rejection, attempts to conceal an identity, often because of safety concerns, wanting to mitigate potential harms. But together, these distal external stressors and the proximal internal stressors lead to more negative physical and mental health outcomes. we also see that resilience is a piece here that can provide a buffer. And acts as a buffer between the stressors and their impacts on our health. So research about the role of minority stress on the lives and experiences of trans and non-binary people has proliferated. It's been amazing. And this work has been so incredibly important. It's shifted the landscape from understanding how we work with trans and non-binary communities. It's vital for understanding why our communities are struggling to survive. It's helped us reframe mental health disparities as a result of social and structural oppression, instead of believing that transgender people are pathologically predisposed or to distress and poor mental health, right? And there's these external pieces. However, there's another piece to this puzzle that I think is tricky, and that's this idea of damage-centered narratives, right? As much as we've focused on understanding the role of discrimination on mental health, we've also created a damage-centered narrative that focuses primarily on the pain, challenges, and tragedies of living life as a trans person. So what we see is a deficit-based perspective, and these ideas shape the narrative about what it means to be trans and non-binary for trans people themselves, but also for those who work with us, for our parents, for our loved ones, for our doctors, for our therapists. It's shaping the narrative of what it means to exist. We also have the added influence of anti-trans activists who further this narrative with alarming stories of misery, regret, often with calls to ban access to care, which is exactly the opposite of what needs to happen. It's created a story of what it means to be trans, right? And in a recent study, queer and trans youth reported feeling as though they, quote unquote, should be more distressed and more upset in their identity because so much of what they hear about is about depression and anxiety with young LGBT folks. I should be feeling worse. Why am I not feeling bad? Is that something bad about me, right? And for our young people to walk around thinking, oh no, I'm not fitting this narrative, right? What does that mean for what we're perpetuating? And the thing is that it's not new. It's a product of our cisnormativity, or this belief that being cisgender is this normal and natural category, and that being transgender is not natural, that it's deviant or not preferred. And as we focus on how hard it is to be transgender, non-binary, gender diverse, gender creative, so as people start to question their gender, they might be fearful. They might try so incredibly hard to not be trans, to push these feelings away. Parents who love and support their children and just want the best for them, who are trying so hard, while also kind of wishing and hoping that it's just a phase, that maybe they won't have to live the hard life of being trans, right? Or perhaps hoping maybe that their kid is just gay and not trans, right? And so we see these narratives proliferate. And I want to say that I'm not here with rose-colored glasses trying to wipe away the very real struggles, right? I've shared those struggles are real. And the more the anti-trans legislation and the heightened violence are perpetuated, we see even more of these disparities. But this is especially true for folks with intersecting systems of oppression that they're facing, right? Specifically, trans folks of color face higher rates of violence. But we know that there's so much more to our lives than just the pain, hardship, and struggle. We shoulder the burden of other people's hate, but their hate is not ours to carry. It's not. Our communities are resilient against this hate because we have to be to survive. So we've expanded the model, not we, but colleagues of mine, Em Matsuno and Tanya Israel, created the Trans Resilience Intervention Model, and it uses the same similar proximal and distal stressors that lead to negative mental health outcomes. But what it has expanded is understanding the individual resilience factors on the right, including hope, including self-acceptance and identity pride, including how we choose to self-define, right? That I get to define how I identify. I get to define my gender, our self-worth, but also our access to transition. It also provides this other piece, which has been missing, I think, in the literature quite a bit, which is group resilience factors, right? That it's not just up to individual people to be resilient against this hate, but that there are group-level resilience factors like being a role model, feeling like you belong in your community, family acceptance, positive role models, social support, activism. And it also provides some of the possible interventions and support to support the development of this individual and collective resilience. So by refocusing our attention on resilience factors, especially those that are more collectivistic and help to expand the community's resilience against this hate, we can move the field toward a more strength-based approach to working with trans and non-binary folks. But in addition to this collective resilience and really thinking about how we understand resilience, it's important to consider how resistance and resilience might both be useful for minoritized folks facing stigma, prejudice, and discrimination. So I had the opportunity to attend a small group conference put on by SPICI, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, and EASP, the European Association for Social Psychology. The conference focused on advances in LGBTQ+ research with scholars around the world. There were several themes that emerged about what we want to see in these advances of LGBT health, and especially around reimagining and re-envisioning the future for queer and trans mental health. Not mental health, queer and trans health. We were put into groups based on our interest in our scholarships and I started meeting with a couple different groups of colleagues. One, to tackle these damage-centered narratives, which I talked about, and another, to really think about how we reimagine trans resilience and moving towards resistance and combining these two with a cross-cultural understanding of both individual and community level resilience. So when we reimagine resilience, resilience is often thought about as bouncing back, right? The ability to recover quickly from adversity and from trauma. It's often thought as a positive adaptation when facing significant adversity. It's often at the individual level that we see folks trying to help people be resilient, right? Let me help you be resilient against this onslaught, which I think has its place. Although collectivistic resilience, right, this collective empowering of an entire community can often offer greater protection against minority stress. Resistance, on the other hand, right, is fighting against the oppressive forces and working towards justice. Resistance is sustained and more possible when we have collective resilience, and so I think these two are quite intertwined. And so to put these together, right, what does it mean to be individually and collectively resilient? And also what is it to stand up against the oppressive forces rather than just reacting to them after they've happened? So both collective and individual resilience are bolstered with resistance against this marginalization. And so moving from resilience to resistance and holding kind of both of these, we really need to have a broader view of what it means to manage being a person with a minoritized identity. But I think we can take this a step further, and this is where we can more deeply explore options for what do we do to help people develop community-based, individualized, all the areas of resistance and resilience that we're talking about. And I think part of this is through radical healing. So with radical healing, we have a framework that looks a little bit like this. So it focuses on healing as a process that's framed by a dialectic, right? Resisting interlocking systems of oppression while also envisioning how we move toward freedom, justice, and liberation. It's rooted in social justice, anti-racist, and liberatory approaches to therapy, and it's anchored by 5 main concepts and circles that you see up there. So critical consciousness. How do we understand how we are situated in our worlds? How do we build consciousness about the role of minority stress, and that we're not just sitting with anxiety and depression alone in our room because we're flawed, but because of the stressors that exist. Cultural authenticity and self-knowledge. How do we come to know ourselves? Radical hope, emotional and social support, and strength and resilience. So it was developed to move beyond these individual level approaches to coping with racial trauma, and it's become a helpful lens through which we can explore healing, rather than just asking people to individually deal with resilience on their own and adapt to the trauma. So we took this model, and as part of a project with Stephanie Budge and Sergio Dominguez, I was invited to lead clinical consultation groups for trans and non-binary therapists of color. The therapists learned about radical healing, the paradigm, how it works, and then we asked them to use this in their therapeutic work with trans and non-binary clients of color. We met monthly in clinical consultation groups and provided consultation support to the therapists in the study. And we were intentional about centering the collective wisdom of the therapist, right? Not, hey, I'm here to be the wise sage and and tell me all your things that are happening with your clients and I'll fix it. We really created a collaborative space where we centered the wisdom of all the therapists in the group to really think about how radical healing could be employed, how it could be centered, and how it could help our clients in the therapeutic process. Through the process, we created a community of care and a healing space for the therapists and the study to connect with one another. And often what we heard, and what I felt, was this is the only space I've ever had where I've been in community with trans therapists of color talking about working with clients who are also trans clients of color. This is amazing. And so they were created to support the therapeutic work, but they were also a space that provided us with an ability to reflect on a community of care, self and other healing with other therapists, and the principles of radical healing were really brought to life. We explored radical healing, acts of resistance, decolonial mental health systems. And I mentioned at the start that I'm personally and professionally very moved by this work as a trans and a trans non-binary person of color. But this is really one of the projects that was so deeply meaningful for the work that I've done. I think it's been definitely personally healing, but I think also professionally healing to be in a space that can exist like this. So sharing space with other trans and non-binary therapists of color, we brought radical healing to life. We focused on the emotional and social support that we all needed from each other, especially because most of us were in systems that were predominantly cis and white. We developed the strength and resilience that we needed to continue this work. We dug into our critical consciousness and made space to show up authentically and deepen our self-knowledge. But the piece that resonated for me most was the radical hope, right? It gave me a space where the conversations weren't easy. They weren't easy conversations to have, but I left feeling rooted in my community, uplifted, but also hopeful and really wanting more opportunities to feel more fully and authentically seen, personally and professionally. And what came of this is conversations as part of this process, conversations with my wife, conversations with lots of folks. What we keep coming back to is joy. What I keep coming back to is joy. And with all of the hate and all of the anti-trans legislation and the grief around people's ability to live and openly and authentically, there's this question of how can we possibly center joy? And my question is, how can we afford not to? So the rhetorical question reminds me of the way that sometimes people think about coping when they're stressed and like self-care when they're stressed out, right? Overworked, overwhelmed. I don't have time for social support. I don't have time for self-care or eating well or sleeping well, right? And yet we also know that those are like the precise moments that you need it most. Oh, hold on. Actually, I do need sleep and to eat and to drink water and like take care of myself. That's what this feels like. So the counter narrative of trans joy is revolutionary because we're told that we shouldn't want to be trans, we shouldn't be trans, we shouldn't, if we are trans, we shouldn't exist, right? We're told all these things, and then if we dare to exist, to live openly and honestly as our true, authentic selves, in a world that's hostile, then all we can expect is damage, deficit, tragedy, trauma. But what about our joy, our love, our pride, our happiness, the ways that we are when we're in spaces that affirm and care for our whole selves, our whole beings, the wounded parts, the raging parts that are raging against the injustice, and the joyful parts? What happens when we're seen as full human? So trans joy, I saw this headline about a year ago. Trans joy is most necessary when it feels most impossible. And I would argue that the current legislative landscape, the removal of gender-affirming care across various states, and the violence aimed at trans and gender-diverse people feels pretty impossible. These are the moments that we need most to lean into our community support, resilience, resistance, and joy. So we have some recent research that has been coming out over the past few years about joy and about gender euphoria. Right? We often hear about gender dysphoria, right? These feelings of not feeling aligned, not feeling right in one's body, feeling like this isn't fitting. And although that is true and it exists and it's real, we also have gender euphoria, right? The good feelings of when we do feel aligned. It's like, oh, hold on, this is working. Someone saw me as the way I want to be seen, right? My hair's working the right way today, right? Like, we have some gender euphoria that happens and some gender joy. And so we have these studies about gender joy that have emerged. And so they did some in-depth interviews with some trans folks, and folks were quick to express their joyfulness in being trans, even in the face of oppression and discrimination and marginalization. People report being happy to be trans. So I'm just gonna put that pause, people are happy to be trans. We are happy. We are happy, full people. They also noted that when they embrace their trans identity, they improve their quality of life, have more self-confidence, a greater sense of body positivity, and a sense of peace and calm, right? That by accepting that peace, it really feels joyful. So my call to action for you all today, in addition to collective resilience and the importance of resilience and building that community resilience and the resistance, thinking about how it might be used, right? How can we use this to help people, help minoritized folks in the face of this stigma, prejudice, and discrimination? So psychologists, we have a call to advocate, right? To be vocal, it's an ethical responsibility, right? It's one of our ethical areas really to push towards justice and social change and policy advocacy. So here are some very few of the things that I think could be helpful. So I think for folks today, educating yourself about gender identity and expression, right? Being open to learning, seeking it out, right? Not expecting that trans and non-binary people will tell you their lived experience and that will be enough, right? Go seek out the books and the podcasts, and we're everywhere, go find us. Create welcoming and affirming spaces, right? And again, that might take some education. What does that look like? What does that mean in your clinic, in your hospital, your university, your boardroom? What does that look like to create a welcoming and affirming space? Connect with others who are advocating for trans health and join in solidarity, right? What are other people doing? Join alongside, offer your support. Don't take over the movement, but offer your support. Speak up when you see misinformation about gender affirming care. Also consider the research questions you're asking. Why are we centering damage? And it's not that we shouldn't, right? Because there's trauma that we've talked about that this whole talk. But if that's the only thing we're asking, then we're missing quite a bit of the puzzle. I will also say that trans communities are in crisis, right? Around this legislation, around the anti-trans hate, and we need support. We need folks to join the movement. And I also want to say that for trans and non-binary folks, or folks who are in your life who are trans and non-binary, I want to remind you to just breathe. Just breathe. That your existence is resilience and is resistance. Develop community of resilience and resistance and joy. Rest, right? And then get up and fight again. But lean into community. This is a quote that I think really sums up a lot of what I've been talking about today. She says, "I don't want to be visible because I'm trans. I want to be seen, affirmed, and celebrated as a whole damn person. I want to wake up without the threat of violence. I want to fall in love, raise a family, and pass down traditions my grandma and mom passed on to me. I want to thrive without fear. I don't want to have to tell you about my path, my pain, so that you can journey toward an understanding that trans folks deserve to breathe, to live and thrive in a world that celebrates all of who we are." So I want to share with you some of my joy. Living, existing as my whole damn authentic self, with my wife and our daughter and our puppy, enjoying a warm, sunny day, flowers with the California superbloom that's happening, and just some playfulness. I'm joyful and I'm thriving when I'm able to be more authentically myself in small moments like this, to stop and smell the flowers with my family, just existing. And in big moments like these talks today, where I can share my vision for what it means to move towards trans liberation with you all. I find joy in community and working with students and clients to recognize their power, their resistance, and their resilience. I find trans joy when I'm reading about our histories, our her stories, our T stories, and all the ways that our existence is not new, has existed across cultures and around the world, including in Mexico, where our existence isn't new, and where my family's from, where the Mouche people are integrated as a third gender category, right? Not tolerated, but really welcome and accepted and celebrated. So as we move towards trans liberation for all minoritized, marginalized, and oppressed people, I leave you with images of these two very influential and powerful change agents. These are Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, and they're could be considered the mothers of the trans and queer liberation movement, helping to dedicate their lives to trans youth, sex workers, and poor incarcerated queers. And the other side says, we honor her legacy by supporting trans women of color to live and lead. And of course, no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. So part of what I hope is that you leave this talk, but also this conference, that you'll interrogate your own assumptions about what you think trans people's lives are like. That you'll take steps to fight against the injustice and attempted eradication and erasure of trans people across the U.S., and that you'll join in uplifting the joyful, powerfully resilient voices of trans and non-binary people around you. Thank you. Questions? All right, thoughts, questions, reactions? Yeah, so the question was, in online communities, right, we can center joy in community with trans folks, but what does it actually look like when you're facing the hate, especially online where folks like to say whatever they want. And I think as psychologists, we can hold a both and for a lot of this work, right? I presented about the trauma and the pain and also about the joy, and I think we can hold both of those. And I think that what's happened is that with our damage-centered narrative, it's really been an attempt, honestly, to say like, look how bad it is. Please have empathy for how hard it is to be in this world, right? And although I think that can move some people, I think it also has had this reverberating effect that everyone just thinks our lives are always hopeless. And so I think there's a balance, and that there's this both and that yes, we are struggling, and yes, we want empathy, but we don't want your pity. I think that's an important distinction, right? Empathy, join alongside in solidarity, right? Push against the hate, but also not pity, oh, poor trans people that, are really, really struggling out there. And so I think it's a both and, that we need to know that people are struggling, like that is real, and that is valid, and that is not going away, and it's not being erased. And also, I think there's a holding of joy and hope and radical hope for what envisioning futures could look like. Because otherwise, I think, especially folks who are in the community, who are trying to come out, who are trying to explore who they are, right? If all we have is this damage-centered narrative that says how hard it is, I think it just perpetuates more of the trauma and the violence. So I think there's a balancing act. Does that help? I think, yeah. And online, just don't even try with the trolls. I mean, you can't. Like, we're not gonna win in a Twitter war. Like, it's not a good place to change hearts and minds. Trolls are what? There you go. I'm glad someone can manage that, because I cannot. Yes. Sorry, I don't think I can hear you. I think we have a mic, though. Yes, so we have actually quite a bit of literature that's been coming out thinking about how we can move our therapy practices from kind of white Western approaches to really understanding spirituality, understanding that, you know, folks don't exist in these systems where we can just put them in a DSM-5 category box, like to really expand and kind of blow up our understanding of kind of white Western, I'm gonna sit back as a therapist and you tell me all your pain and I'm gonna, you know, read magic wand and not fix, like that we can shift these narratives to share power, to really make mental health more accessible, to make sure that folks are really seen and valued and heard for all of their identities, and that it's not, they're not pathologized. But there's a lot of really great work around liberation psychology that I think pushes us in that direction. So if you're looking for like books and readings, like look up liberation psychology and decolonial mental health, and I think there's a lot of work there that would be really helpful. Yeah.
Thank you for everything you shared. I work with clinical PsyD students, and a lot of the time we're talking about the politics of diagnosing trans people. And so what advice would you give them when they're working within, I mean, I know you're doing the guidelines and all of these great things, but when you're working within the DSM?
Yeah, so the question was about the politics of, you know, providing a diagnosis around gender dysphoria. And I think there are a lot of folks who have written about really thinking about the balancing act, right? And on the one hand, folks need access to care. And again, this is one of like the decolonial, like, you know, ways of moving away, right? We need a diagnosis to access the insurance to access our care, right? That's why we need a diagnosis. And so I think if there's not a request for like, hey, I need a letter or I'm seeking something from my insurance, is there a reason to diagnose, right? And so often I will not diagnose someone unless there's a reason to, and then I say, hey, just so you know, if you want to use your insurance for this medical procedure, you need a diagnosis. Your insurance company is going to require it. Let's put a diagnosis. Let's make sure you get the access to your care. But that's why it's there, not because you actually have anything wrong with you. And so I think the movement from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria was a great step, but I don't think it's gone far enough, and I think we just need to not be in the DSM. And so as we saw, homosexuality was removed from the DSM in 1973, and then, you know, we see this shift of, you know, gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, and I do think that, you know, we experience a lot of distress. But like I said in the talk, it's not often the distress that's just internal, it's the societal expectations of what it means to be trans and then having to live in this world as trans. It's distressing, right? And so how can we center trans voices? And I think what I'm hearing a lot from trans voices and trans communities is we don't need to be in there. But we do need it there if you're gonna still require it for accessing our care. So there's this, I think, balancing act of using it to help people move toward their most liberated version of themselves, which sometimes means putting a diagnosis, getting that care, and then walking away from that system. So problematic, right? So the idea that folks with autism can't also have a gender identity that they know and explore and experience, right? We know that for folks, for autistic folks, there's a lot of thinking outside the box, creative thinking, moving beyond, you know, the limits and the confines of social structures, right? I think for autistic folks, there's just a lot more space to explore, hey, wait, I don't have to be this box that you put me in, right? I'm outside of these experiences and social norms. So I'm also going to be outside these experiences and social norms of my gender. I think there's a lot more freedom, especially with my autistic trans clients, there's a lot more freedom to explore, right? Like, I already don't fit in these boxes, like, these other ones also don't fit for me, so let's explore that. And I think it's really problematic to say that folks with autism can't also know their gender identity in very true and valuable, deep, meaningful ways. And I think, as with all of this anti-trans legislation, I think that they're a smokescreen for what is the best talking point to not let this go forward, to stop trans people. And I think it's just another talking point. And so, as with all of the other ones, right, people are gonna regret it. People just, they either need to know from a young age that they were trans, but also how could you ever know, you're so young, right? And so we have a lot of these that are just being used to target trans folks. And so I don't think that there's any basis in these anti-trans arguments. And so my best recommendation is to poke holes in that, right? Because they're not based in science. So much of what we're seeing is just not based in science. And we do science, right? We understand science and we read it and can interpret it for the public. And so if there are ways to interpret that for the broader public and to have a voice there, I think that would be helpful. Kelly, how much more time do we have?
18.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for the work that you do and presenting about it. So as a clinician and as an academic researcher, I'm curious if you can share some of your experiences on how to get this community involved in creative research, and research, given the history of psychology and how you can impact this community. So I'm wondering if you can share some of that.
Yeah, so the question was about how to involve and include trans people in research, especially knowing our troubled history with trans folks in research. And so I think part of what I've been working on with community-based action research is to really include people from the very beginning. But I think there are a few key things that need to happen. One, I think we need to balance power hierarchies, and right, as researchers, we hold a lot of power, and we have funding behind us or not, or we have, right, like we have institutional power. And so how do we balance those power hierarchies and bring people to the table really valuing their experiences and not sitting up here saying, and here I'm gonna put this group together, but I'm still in charge, right? So how do we balance that out a little bit? And use what we know and our institutional resources to also bring their voices up. But I think there's a few key pieces, right? We need to pay people. We need to pay people for their work, for their labor, for their knowledge, for their experiences, to sit around the table, to have these conversations with you, the researcher, who's gonna walk away with this data, publish it, make your career better. And so I think we need to pay people. I think that's a big piece of it. But there's also this distrust. And I think part of that distrust, right, is valid and it's real. And who are you and what questions are you asking? I'm having this experience right now with folks who are like, can we have an interview for the New York Times or this or that? No, not for the New York Times, because what they're putting out right now are these think pieces that are very problematic, right? And so who's asking and what are the goals? And so I think we need to build trust with communities. And part of that is showing up to events, being seen, being known, right? Not just saying, hey, I have this study, will you come participate? Who's asking, right? I'm gonna protect my well-being, I'm gonna protect my community, and I don't know what you're gonna go off and run and do with this data. Are you gonna perpetuate the trans narratives that everything is, damage-centered and horrible? I have some questions about some of the presentations here, this weekend that I'm very curious. I'm like, where are we taking this story? Because it's not looking so good based on your framing of the data. And so I think building trust. So showing up to events, making yourself known, paying people for their work, and then involving folks from the time we ask the question. What are the research questions? Because right, we can sit back in our ivory towers and say, this is what I want to know. But I think when we ask the community who's actually really affected by this, what is it that you all are needing? They're like, we don't care about this other piece that you're doing. We actually are having a really hard time accessing care, right? Accessing intervention. So asking the community what they want and need, and then helping to support that. Does that help a little bit? Yeah.
We still have time for questions. I saw some other hands previously.
So thank you. And I also was wondering if you would be available to speak after, like at the conference elsewhere.
Yes, yeah, come find me. That was actually one of the things I didn't put in my notes, but like, come find me, like, come talk to me. Like, I actually, as I was getting ready for this conference, I'm like, what other trans talks are there? Like, what other things can I go to? How do I find all the other queer trans folks? And I was like, wait, some of them might be at my talk. Come find me, right? Like, you know, I would love to chat. Yeah, I'll be here, you know, after this. You'll see me with my daughter and wife, probably walking around. But then my wife presents tomorrow, so we'll be around tomorrow. Yeah. Also, my email. I didn't put it on here. Sorry. Is it in the program? Or are emails in there? Okay.
Can you type that
Happy
aside?
to share that. Yeah, I don't know if it's in the program.
Can you type that aside?
Type it right here. While you all do that. Are there other questions?
First, I just want to say thank you so much for doing this talk. As somebody who's about to leave their graduate training and wants to stay in academia as a non-binary person, how can I navigate spaces within academia, correcting historical miseducation, but also being self-protective and trying to resist against children themselves? And then relatedly, you know, student advocacy and organizing for can be very high odds with institutions. So,
Yeah, the question is like, how do we survive in academia? How do we not tokenize ourselves? How do we do the work that we want to do without burning out? Yeah, and I think part of what I'll say is that self-preservation above all else, right? Like, I think that we can give ourselves to the work and we can give ourselves to our community, but if we have nothing left at the end of the day, then we fizzle out. So I think finding communities of support and care, also like if you're able to and if you can, like especially if you can find mentors and support and people who can rally around you and not just do it on your own. I think that's key, right? This community resilience piece, right? Like how do we do it together? I'm happy to have conversations, right? Like, because I think the other piece is that the academy needs you, right? The academy needs your voice, and not as a token, right? I think that's a big piece, and not to tokenize ourselves and say, now I am the voice of all trans people who ever existed. Like that just doesn't help us, and it doesn't move our activism forward. When I was in grad school, I had been as an undergrad, I was very active. I was an activist all across campus. I was doing all these things, and then in grad school, it was like I had zero time for anything but reading and writing, and like I cannot. And so I talked to my advisor, Tanya Israel, who is very active and an activist, and part of what she said is do what sustains you, and activism was sustaining me. So like, go out and do it, right? Like, get involved. It's like, but I also need to write this paper. She's like, you'll write the papers. Like, you can do it both. You can do it later. Like, the activism will be there. If you need to sit and get through this so that you can get into, you know, finish your degree and move forward and influence the field from within, the activism will still be there, right? And so, being from within a community, but also still doing grassroots activism, I think, has a bit of a top-down and a bottom-up approach, right? And we get to be in spaces and be in places like this to share our thoughts and our views, right? If we aren't here, who's going to be sharing those? And so, yes, but find the mentors, find the people, right? Find the community that's going to uplift you and to support you through it. And there are, I will say, the network of trans and non-binary scholars has increased a lot in psychology. We have Facebook groups, so like, right, but like there are networks now, because now we have professors who are in the field, who are doing this work, who are open and out and trans and non-binary and really hoping to like help this pipeline along and not to have you just do it by yourself, not to have you fizzle out. So, yeah, protect yourself and lean into some joy.
Do we have any other questions?
I'm curious as to whether or not there's any research out there for transgender incarcerated individuals.
Yes, there is. There's a lot of work right now happening. I'm not involved in it, but I know that there's a lot happening, especially around how we treat folks who are trans and incarcerated, especially around, it's so segregated based on sex often, but there has been movement toward housing people in their affirmed gender. There's also some work around the access to medical care, and this varies by state. Right, so in some states, folks are accessing their medical care as trans people, and in some states they're barred from it. And so I think the headlines of this anti-trans legislation has kind of taken center stage, but there has been a lot in the news and also in research around how do we support folks to be their affirmed selves and to have access to care, life-saving care, whether they're incarcerated or not. And so I don't know that work well, but I do know that it exists. We need to make sure we take care of folks, whether they're incarcerated, or not. There are big movements to make sure that folks are being cared for in appropriate ways. Yeah.
First of all, I just want to say that I really like this talk and I love how you focus on the joy of being non-binary and transgender. I think my question would be to center parents. When doing research and representing people of different identities, how can researchers encompass the variety of gender expression? Because right now I feel like most of us is female and not so clear the category for only one people. How can researchers change that to be successful collectively?
Yes, that's a great question. So the question was about how do we work with the multitude of gender identities that exist when we're doing, especially quantitative research, when we're like, hey, you're a man, you're a woman, or the unfortunate otherwise, right? So there's some research and some work around asking about gender in kind of a two-pronged approach. And so, so asking someone about how they identify, right? And when possible, right, which is not always the case with research when we have hundreds or thousands of data points, to leave an open line, right? Often clinicians, I encourage clinicians, you have one person, you can read that, right? Like, even if it's in a system, like, you can categorize that if you need to, right? But for research, I do think that often checking a box makes it easier to manage our data, and so having options and putting, man, woman, and not putting trans as an option, right? Because folks who are trans, that is part of their lived experience, but they also might just identify as a man or just identify as a woman. And so if you're like, oh no, you don't get to be in the man or woman category, you're in the trans category, right? That's really problematic. And so instead we can say, male, female, or man, woman, non-binary, genderqueer, right? We can start listing them all, but then that gets really long. And so often what we ask is about someone's gender identity with a few different options, right? Man, woman, non-binary, something else, right? Some other identity, but like not other. And then asking another question that says, what is the question? I can't remember what we did recently. If someone has a trans history, I think we can ask about sex assigned at birth, also in gender. And then when you cross-tabs that, you can say like, oh, someone was assigned female at birth and now identifies as male, they will fit into a trans category, right? And so that's one way. But I think not just putting other, and also not treating trans as something that is inherently separate from a male or female checklist box. Yeah. Do others have any good tips? Like I saw a lot of nodding heads, like yes. Everyone's doing this research and like, how do we categorize and how do we ask in appropriate ways?
So we have a few more minutes if there are any final questions.
This conversation in rural contexts and in rural institutions, communities, they're not going to come here every time. So they need to but thinking about nuances of rural spaces.
Yeah, I think, so in rural spaces, I think access to care can look a lot different, depending on who's available. If there is care, right, with doctors who are affirming, therapists who are affirming, just finding social support. And so often what we'll see is that people move online, right, to find social support online. I also think that this is generational. There's a lot of, people are like, I talk to my young clients, and I was like, there's a support group, you can go meet people, and they're like, why do I do that? That's so weird. I have friends, no, they're not trans, they're not binary, but like, my community's online. And so I think for rural communities, this is also can be helpful, right? To move online and find communities online. I think depending on what the need is, right? Like sometimes depending on how proximity to close cities, you know, often there's traveling, and so it becomes a barrier to accessing healthcare and mental health care. I think the not just social support moving online, but also telehealth and being able to access doctors and therapists virtually has really helped expand access to care. But I'm in San Luis Obispo, which is about 4.5, maybe 5 hours north of here, like probably 8 hours with traffic. But we're right on the coast, and it's kind of semi-rural. We have a main kind of town area, but a lot of little small communities. And we talk about this a lot, like because we are 4 to 6 hours from San Francisco and LA, kind of stuck in this little middle space, how do we make sure that our folks feel connected and feel seen? And because we have a university, I think that brings a lot of chance for social support, but also because we've been shifting our access to care around our university, that's been helpful. So I think it depends on what the need is, but I think what I see is a lot of moving online for that kind of stuff. But I'm happy to chat a little bit more. We have a paper that came out looking at community connectedness and access to care in semi-rural communities, because I'm semi-rural, and really thinking about how people create community, and also that, like, I think people think that rural communities are not as progressive, and that can be the case, right, for lots of rural communities, and it's also not always the case. And that sometimes the connections that people have with their small group of social support or their small group of providers, right, is, people talk about it being a deeper, more meaningful connection than some of the folks that we're talking to in San Francisco who are like, I'm surrounded, but I know no one, right? Like, I know they're out there, but I don't even know where to start. And so sometimes that connection can be even more impactful and more meaningful when there's just a small group of us and we're hanging together. And so, I mean, I even think about some of the clients I have right now who are very connected in more rural areas, and I have a client who's by San Francisco, and like, I am not connected at all. I don't even know where to start. So I think it can vary, but we can definitely chat.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much, and thank you, Dr. Bettergarcia, for your incredible talk and work. It clearly sparked such meaningful discussion. There's nothing happening in this space until 10, so I'd encourage you to, if Dr. Bettergarcia has a little bit of time, you can make some initial introductions, but if anyone wants to use this space to connect with one another, of course, feel free. So thank you all so much for being here, and again.